Welcome to the Boxing Gossip channel. Many thanks, as ever, for tuning in. If you are new or if you haven't done so before, please press subscribe. This may not be the longest video I record this year. When I do a story on the channel, when there's an update to the story, I always like to cover it just because people who've been informed by some of the content that I've done up previously, I'd like them to see how it's moving on. So in this video, I'm going to discuss two fights. The first fight is going to be relating to Adonis Stevenson. Now around Christmas time I posted a video at something like the name The Curse of Adonis Stevenson, or The Curious Case of Adonis Stevenson. That was it, The Curious Case of Adonis Stevenson, and it talked about his inactivity and the fact he hadn't been involved in notable fights for many years. Well, according to WBC President Mauricio Suleiman, Adonis Stevenson will take on Badou Jack, and seemingly, according to Mauricio Suleiman, that fight is going to happen. I think it's an excellent fight. I think it's a truly excellent fight. Two of the big guns at 175 pounds. Two big names squaring off against each other. And I think it could be an excellent fight. It's one that I'm really looking forward to. You want to stick a gun to my head and ask me who I'm picking? At this stage, I'm picking Badou Jack. And funnily enough, the reason I'm picking Badou Jack is for a number of the reasons that I mentioned in that video, The Curious Case of Adonis Stevenson. Badou Jack's someone who has improved in each of his recent fights. He's a far better fighter than the prospect who got knocked out by Derek Edwards years ago. If you look back on his 2017, you can kind of say with the benefit of hindsight, he ruined James DeGale, who was the consensus #1 at super middleweight at the time, stepped up to 175 pounds, and then ruined Nathan Cleverly, who was a world champion in the division. This is a guy who's improving. This is a guy who has addressed the deficiencies in his game. This is a guy who represents a real tough, strong, well-rounded fighter. Adonis Stevenson, he's very good. Is he predictable? Possibly. Are his best days behind him? Probably. The guy's 40 years old now. It's unlikely he's still going to be at his best, and maybe that decline hasn't been exposed because of the level of opposition he's been facing. But against Badou Jack, I think Adonis Stevenson's time is up, and I think Adonis Stevenson will get found out. My early thoughts are that Badou Jack wins that fight. Adonis Stevenson still has a lot of power. If he clips Badou Jack, you don't rule out I'm not going to call it an upset because Stevenson's the reigning champion, but you don't rule out Stevenson in the fight. But for me, I'd be siding with Badou Jack. As an aside, Eleider Alvarez, who's been the mandatory for Adonis Stevenson for what feels like millenniums, has to fight Alexander Gvozdyk for a final eliminator. I think it's for the WBC interim title. Eleider Alvarez, I wonder if he's been paid some step-aside money or something like that. He's got a right to feel aggrieved in my book. He's an unlucky so-and-so. He's been in that position for years, waiting for his chance at the title. Now the Badou Jack fight's come along. Somehow the WBC have been happy to run with that as opposed to making the Eleider Alvarez fight for the world title. I know Eleider Alvarez might know Adonis Stevenson. I've heard that they're in camp together, etc. So maybe there's been some sort of agreement behind the scenes. If there has been, then disregard what I'm saying here. But he's going up against someone who's considered a bit of a killer in Alexander Gvozdyk, and it seems harsh and unfair that having waited so long to finally get his chance at fighting for a world title, it's been taken away from him at this stage, and he's now having to fight a final eliminator against someone he'll start as a substantial underdog on. But that's an aside. Look, 2018, I've talked about it on the channel before. It's already shaping up to be a truly fantastic year of boxing. Lots of big fights made early. And, Adonis Stevenson, Badou Jack, that really is another one to throw into the mix. I'll be extremely excited for that fight. Another fight that's been heavily rumoured. This fight has not been confirmed, but I'm hearing Scott Quigg will take on Oscar Valdez on March the 10th. Now, I wanted to cover this fight specifically because I did a video 2-3 days ago now talking about the featherweight division and who would win in a featherweight World Boxing Super Series division. And in that video, I actually referred to the fact that a number of the featherweights were scheduled to fight each other anyway. Lee Selby versus Josh Warrington, for example. I also talked about Carl Frampton versus Nonito Donaire. We'll throw another one into the mix here, Scott Quigg versus Oscar Valdez. These are two guys who I believe may know each other from their time with Freddie Roach at the Wildcard Gym. They've done sparring there, and the talk is that they're going to square off against each other in the ring. Oscar Valdez, reigning world champion. Scott Quigg, obviously taking his role as the challenger. For me, this is a tough ask for Quigg. I view Valdez as by far the superior fighter in terms of skills, and by far the superior fighter in terms of technique, power, all of that good stuff. Really, Scott Quigg has not progressed since leaving Joe Gallagher and gone to Freddie Roach. And if anything, he's been a kind of fighter who's led with his chin and been sucked into scraps far too often, which has been a constant concern when watching Scott Quigg fights. Up against Oscar Valdez, it's a very tough ask. You're looking at a guy who's been in the weight division longer, who looks more skilled, frankly more talented, who looks like he carries a bit more power, and you just wonder if Valdez has the power, the potential to take Scott Quigg to school and really put on a bit of a beating. I hope Scott Quigg is earning a real good payday for this fight, because Quigg wasn't in a bad position. He's still there or thereabouts in the contents of the featherweight, super bantamweight division. His only loss came in very respectable form when he drew Carl Frampton close, but for me this is very questionable matchmaking. I understand Scott Quigg hasn't been the easiest guy to match, but you have to wonder if he was with Frank Warren and if he was in that British mix that Frank's got with Carl Frampton, Warrington, Selby. You wonder if you could get Quigg, maybe Kid Galahad in that mix and get the guys fighting against each other. Perhaps the domestic names would generate more money and be more winnable fights for Scott Quigg. I don't know, but you could potentially still pick Scott Quigg over a name like a Josh Warrington, for example. I don't know who you'd side with in that fight, but against Oscar Valdez, it's a tough ask. And while Scott Quigg is getting an opportunity to fight for a world champion, and I appreciate names like Warrington, Frampton, and Kid Galahad don't have world championships attached to their name right now, whilst he's getting that, you're going to assume he's going to be an away fighter, fighting against the odds when he's a big underdog and potentially not getting a life-changing payday. I don't know. Be interesting to see if some more detail comes through there. But anyway, these are my thoughts. Good to see these fights getting made. Whoever you think is going to win, Adonis Stevenson versus Badou Jack, Eleider Alvarez versus Alexander Gvozdyk, Oscar Valdez versus Scott Quigg. These are big fights to add to the schedule. And I've got to say that in my opinion, these are fights who, these are fights where we really have the potential to see stars getting made. These are fights where the winner of the fight could go on to be a real player in their division. Looking at the guys involved, Valdez, he has the potential to become a bit of a star. He has the potential to mix it with the other great names at featherweight and potentially be considered a pound-for-pound star in the future. Looking at names like Badou Jack, if he goes and beats Adonis Stevenson, there might be unification matchups with the likes of Sergei Kovalev. Those are the guys in the division. Dmitry Bivol maybe in future. Even Alexander Gvozdyk, he's supposed to be the next big thing. If he's able to run through a guy like Eleider Alvarez and throw his hat into the ring, then potentially he's another name that could be red hot in 2018. But either way, 2018 shaping up very nicely. Let me know your thoughts on these fights. Let me know your thoughts on the surrounding sagas. Is Quigg being fed to the wolves a bit here? Would he be better staying in that domestic mix? Does he have a chance against Oscar Valdez? Is it a step up for Oscar Valdez? You tell me. Badou Jack versus Adonis Stevenson. What's your thought on that fight? Is it a fight that you're looking forward to? Are you happy with the way the WBC has handled this situation? It seems a bit of a bizarre one. Eleider Alvarez, the #1 contender, sat there waiting, now having to fight another final eliminator for some sort of interim belt. Are we happy with that kind of arrangement when, all the while you've got Adonis Stevenson sitting there inactive? It's a strange sport, boxing. But anyway, there you go. Leave your comments in the section below. Let me know your thoughts. As always, normal request, if you haven't already done so, please take the time to hit subscribe. If you're new to the channel, please hit the thumbs up button. You can also check out any of my social media. You can give me a follow on Twitter, @BoxingGossip. There should be a link in the description box below to add me as a friend on Facebook. There should also be a link to check out my Patreon page where you can make request videos and do all sorts of other good stuff if you're interested in checking that sort of stuff out. Other than that, let me say thanks for tuning in, and as always, do appreciate you guys checking out my stuff. Thank you guys.